The last half-mile of the Lark Court Drive had turned to grey water. Eleanor Moore walked it on foot, her single trunk on a farm cart behind her. And she smelled the house before she saw it. Not rain. Not the ordinary dampness of a country house left too long between seasons. Something older and more particular, the smell of leather going soft, of paper returning slowly to pulp. Of a closed room that had forgotten what air was for. She began to walk faster. The drive opened into a gravel forecourt. No one came out to meet her. The great front door stood ajar, which was either a welcome or an oversight. And Eleanor had learned not to assume the former. She left the cartman with her trunk and went in. The entrance hall was high and cold. The curtains on the tall windows had not been drawn back that morning, or perhaps that week. The light that came through them arrived grey and second-hand. The color of water at the bottom of a well. A housemaid appeared at the far end of the passage, saw Eleanor, and retreated without a word. Eleanor followed the smell that led her down a long corridor, past closed doors, past a staircase of considerable ambition and uncertain maintenance. And stopped at a door of dark oak that stood half open. She pushed it. She had known, in the abstract, that Lark Court had a library. The Dowager Duchess letters had mentioned it, a substantial collection, much in need of attention. Eleanor had formed a serviceable mental image. A room of moderate size, some damp, some disorder, the ordinary entropy of a house without a housekeeper. The room she was standing in had nothing to do with that image. It was double height, with a gallery running the full circumference at the upper level. And shelves from floor to ceiling on all four walls. 2 centuries of reading, at least. The collection had been, once, extraordinary. The lower shelves had failed. There was no other word. The books had slid, many of them. From their positions, whether from swelling in the damp or from the settling of the cases, she could not yet say, and had accumulated on the floor in drifts of board and spine and loose signature. Knee-deep in places. A leak from the clerestory window above had found the largest of these drifts and was working through it with the patient industry of water, one drop at a time. Eleanor stood in the doorway and looked at it for exactly 4 seconds, then she stepped inside. Crossed to the drift nearest the leak, and crouched. She began to work from the bottom, lifting carefully. Because the worst damage would be there and she needed to know what she was dealing with before she touched anything above it. 3rd book from the base. She turned it to the spine, Philosophia Botanica. Linnaeus. Amsterdam. 1751, first edition. It was soaked through the lower third. The binding had gone the consistency of wet cloth. She stood, carried it to the nearest table, a long reading table, oak. Buried under a foot of displaced volumes, and set it down with the spine vertical on a dry section of cloth she pulled from her pocket. It needed air from both sides. She propped the pages open with 2 smaller books placed flat. Not that one, said a voice. The one beside it. Eleanor looked up. She had not seen the woman in the chair. The chair was high-backed and dark, positioned near the far window away from the worst of the mess, and the woman in it was the color of the room: grey dress, grey shawl. Grey hair drawn up with a precision that suggested old habit rather than current effort. Her hands in her lap were badly gone with age, the knuckles large and crooked. Her eyes had not gone anywhere at all. There is a hook beside it, the woman said. Without moving. The Micrographia. It was under the Linnaeus. It is in worse condition and it is worth considerably more. I would have pointed it out myself, but I cannot get down from this chair without assistance. And the girl who was supposed to come an hour ago has apparently dissolved. Eleanor found the hook. It was in worse condition. She treated it accordingly. You are Miss Moore, the woman said. Yes. Madame, my grandson told me you would not come. He said no one sensible would take a position in a house with a library in this condition. I told him that was a failure of imagination on his part. She regarded Eleanor with unblinking attention. You are not what I expected. That I am sorry to disappoint. You, ma'am. That I did not say I was disappointed. I said you are not what I expected. There is a considerable difference, and if you mean to get on in this world, you had better learn to hear it. She tapped the arm of the chair. Sit down. There where I can see your face, Eleanor. Saturday. I am Petronella. The woman said. The Dowager Duchess of Northwell. You may think whatever you like about that, provided you do not say it aloud. My grandson is the present Duke. He is 31 years old, and he has not set foot in this room since April of last year. And I do not expect him to begin tonight. He has given the management of the estate to a man called Grimshaw, who has given the library to the mice, and who will not be pleased to see you here. She folded her ruined hands. I am telling you this now, before you have taken off your coat. Because I have learned that the women I send away because I did not tell them enough at the beginning. The 3 before you left because they did not know what they were walking into. What happened to the 3 before me? The first left after 2 days. She said the smell gave her headaches. The second lasted a week. Grimshaw made her cry in the passage over the question of whether she had authority to open a window. The third. Petronella paused. The third lasted a month and then wrote me a letter explaining that she had found a position elsewhere. I believe she was lying, and I believe it was my grandson's silence that drove her out. He does not speak, these days. He walks through his own house as though he is a visitor who has already decided not to stay. Eleanor looked at the leaking ceiling. The drifts of fallen books, the unopened case of damp prevention equipment sitting against the far wall with its invoice still tacked to the lid, she said. How long has the leak been going? Since last winter. The repair was supposedly carried out in October. I have the receipt. The repair was not carried out, Eleanor said. She was looking at the stain pattern on the plaster above the graduated rings of a recurring leak, not a new one. Not a patched one. The staining suggests at least 14 months of consistent water ingress. Possibly longer. Petronella said nothing. Her expression did not change. The equipment against that wall, Eleanor said. For humidity control. Has it been installed? It has been invoiced. That is not the same thing. No, said the Dowager Duchess. It is not. She studied Eleanor for a moment. You came in. And the first thing you did was not look at the room. You looked at the books. The room is a building matter. The books are. Eleanor stopped. The books are what? Eleanor looked at the Linnaeus drawing on the table. She thought about the answer. Then she said. The books are what is actually at stake. Petronella was quiet for a long moment. Then something shifted in her face, not softening, exactly, but a kind of recalibration, as if something she had been uncertain of had been confirmed. Why granddaughter Cecily managed this library. She said. From the age of 16 until she died last spring. She was 20. A fever, in April. She had read every book in this room. Every one. A pause. After she died. My grandson locked the door and gave the keys to Grimshaw. Grimshaw told him it was for safekeeping. My grandson was not in a condition to evaluate the claim. Eleanor said nothing. She sat in that chair, Petronella said. Where you are sitting now. She would read the newspapers aloud if my grandson was in the room, because she said a library should have a voice in it and he would not provide one. She looked at the window. I have had 3 companions in this room in a year. And not one of them sat in that chair without shifting it. You sat where I put you and you have not moved. That I was listening. Ma'am, that I know. That is precisely what I mean. Petronella reached beside her and lifted a small carved box. She placed it on her knee but did not open it. Tell me one thing before we discuss terms. You came in, you found a first edition of the Linnaeus in floodwater. And you treated it before you introduced yourself, before you found out whether you had the position, before you knew if anyone in this house would care whether you saved it or not. She looked at Eleanor steadily. Why? Eleanor thought about it, because it was going to be ruined in another 10 minutes, she said, and I knew how to stop that. And that seemed like a sufficient reason. Petronella opened the box. The evening came down slowly over Lark Court. The rain had stopped. The forecourt gravel was still dark with it when the Duke of Northwell came down the main staircase and turned left toward the back of the house. Toward the room he passed every day without stopping. Tonight the door was open. A light was burning inside that he stopped. Through the door he could see a woman he did not recognize crouched on the floor amid a great catastrophe of displaced books. Her dress was dark gray. Her sleeves rolled above the elbow. She was lifting a volume from the lower layer of a drift with the particular care of someone who has done this before. 2 hands, no hurry. Weight transferred slowly so that the damaged binding did not flex. She set the book on the table. She picked up a pen and wrote something in a small notebook. Then she went back for the next one. The table already held perhaps 40 books. They were separated from each other by a finger's width. Spines vertical, cloth laid under each one. The casement window at the far end stood open for the first time he could remember. The smell of mold was already less. Dorset appeared at his elbow with the silence of a man who had been doing this for 40 years. Miss Moore. Your Grace. The Dowager's new librarian. Dorset paused in the way that contained an opinion. She arrived this afternoon, sir. In the rain, the Duke looked at the small figure on the floor, moving methodically through the wreckage of 2 years of neglect. She won't tame this, he said. It was not cruel. It was simply what he believed. It would take a year just to understand the scope of it. Shall be gone by the end of the month. Dorset said nothing. He was watching Miss Moore set down a volume, consult her notebook, write 2 lines. And move to the next with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has not yet decided to be discouraged. In 40 years of service, Dorset had learned to keep certain observations in a particular internal room where they could sit undisturbed until they were needed. He put this one there now. Then he went down to see about carrying the young woman's trunk himself. Eleanor had been at Lark Court for 9 days when she understood that the chaos was not accidental. Accidental chaos had a character she recognized. She had grown up in a house run by a man who grieved too largely for any room to hold him, and she knew what neglect looked like: the linen not turned, the accounts not kept, the kitchen ordering by habit rather than by need. Neglect was inattention. It spread evenly, without preference, the way damp spreads. What she was finding in the library did not spread evenly. The mold was worst on the north wall. 3rd and 4th shelf from the top, the section that housed the estate's collection of 17th-century natural philosophy. She had catalogued that section first because the damage appeared most urgent. Now, standing on the upper gallery with her notebook, she counted again. The catalogue register, Grimshaw's register. The one kept in the estate office and periodically shown to the Dowager as proof of responsible management, listed 43 volumes in that section. She had found 31. She went back to the register. The missing 12 were all first or early editions. The 8 most valuable items in the C election were among them. She went to the workroom behind the estate office, where Grimshaw kept the maintenance receipts, and asked the under-secretary, a pale young man called Fitch who seemed to be perpetually apologizing for his own existence, whether she might look at the disposal records for the library. Fitch looked uncomfortable. The library disposal records, she said again. Pleasantly, Fitch produced them after a 10-minute interval that suggested a prior consultation with someone whose name he did not offer. The records showed 12 volumes removed from the North Wall collection in November of the previous year. Listed as too severely damaged by damp and insect activity for preservation, disposed of accordingly. The disposal date was the 14th of November. Eleanor noted it. The following day she walked into Merrow, the market town 4 miles east, on the pretext of establishing an account with the stationer for the library's supply of record paper. While she was there, she stopped at the premises of Haverstock and Son, the only book dealer of any substance in the county Mr. Haverstock the younger was a cautious man who became less cautious when Eleanor showed him her notebook, open to the page listing the 12 missing volumes, and explained that she was attempting to trace the history of certain items from the Lark Court collection, that he knew the volumes. He was unhappy to find that she knew he knew them, that we acquired them in November, he said. All entirely above board. Receipt signed. Price agreed. Agreed with whom? A pause. With the estate's agent Mr. Grimshaw. Another pause. The estate's agent, Mr. Haverstock repeated. With the firmness of a man who has decided that precision is his only remaining ally, Eleanor wrote the figure he named in her notebook. She thanked him for his time. She walked back to Lark Court in the thin autumn light with her hands in her pockets. Thinking, the 12 volumes had been sold. The sale had been recorded as disposal. The difference between the sale price which had gone somewhere and the disposal record which listed nothing received was approximately £68. £68 was, she noted, almost exactly the amount listed in the estate accounts for the installation of the humidity control equipment that had arrived at Lark Court in its unopened crate. She stood for a moment in the forecourt with the cold on her face, looking at nothing in particular, then she went inside. Took off her coat, and went back to the catalogue. She said nothing to anyone, that evening. Grimshaw found her in the upper gallery and stood below her on the main floor with his hands clasped and his face arranged in its customary expression of smooth helpfulness. "Miss Moore." His voice had the quality of a man who had never once needed to raise it to get what he wanted. "I wanted to make sure you had found everything you needed." The Dowager's instructions, as I understood them, covered the lower gallery. The lower gallery was easier to access. Eleanor said. "The upper section sustains more damage from the roof line. I thought it made sense to establish the scope before I began. Of course." He smiled. "And the estate records. I understand you visited the workroom yesterday. That I was looking for the disposal documentation. For the library cattle." "Oh, of course." The smile did not change. "I only mention it because the estate records, the full estate records, are somewhat specialized in their organization. I wouldn't want you to draw incorrect conclusions from something taken out of context." Eleanor looked down at him over the gallery railing. "I don't draw conclusions from single documents," she said. "I cross-reference." Something passed across Grimshaw's face. It was not anger, exactly. It was the look of a man recalculating. "Of course," he said. "For the third time. Well. I'm glad to hear the work is going well. Do let me know if you need anything." That he left. Eleanor watched him go. Then she opened her notebook to the page where she had written November 14th, 12 volumes. £68. Humidity equipment invoice, £65. 10 shillings. She added a third line, very small, in the margin. "2 sets of books." She closed the notebook. She went back to the catalogue. The catalogue took shape the way Eleanor had learned most honest things took shape, slowly, without drama. One entry at a time, she worked from the upper gallery downward, section by section, shelf by shelf. She recorded title, author, date, edition, publisher, current condition, and location on a grid she had designed herself in the first week. 4 columns, consistent notation. Nothing that could be misread or disputed. She had learned young that a record was only as useful as its clarity. Her father had kept the parish accounts in a hand so idiosyncratic that she had spent 3 weeks after his death simply learning to read them before she could begin to understand them. She had not repeated that mistake. By the 3rd week she had catalogued 11 of the library's 22 sections. By the 4th week she had found 4 more discrepancies. They followed the same pattern as the first. The register listed volumes that were not on the shelves. The disposal records attributed their absence to damage. The damage, in each case, had been recorded with the same phrase: "too severely deteriorated for preservation," in the same hand, on dates that clustered in the autumn and winter months. When the library was coldest and least visited and the light failed before 4 o'clock, she did not go back to Haverstocks. She did not need to. She had enough to see the shape of it. She was working her way through the east wall. The section that housed the estate's collection of early printed natural history. When she found the anomaly that made it impossible to continue saying nothing, the register listed a copy of Gessner's Historia Animalium, the 1551 Zurich edition, 5 folio volumes, as present and in good condition. Last inspected 18 months ago. Eleanor had been looking forward to it. It was, if genuine, the most valuable single item the library was likely to hold. She found volumes 1, 2, and 4. Volumes 3 and 5 were not on the shelf, not in the drift on the floor. Not misfiled in either adjacent section. She checked the disposal records. The Historia Animalium did not appear in them at all. She stood at the east wall for a long time. The missing volumes had not been recorded as damaged. They had not been recorded as disposed of. They were simply absent. Hitch meant either that someone had removed them without recording the removal, or that they had been taken after the last inspection taken, not lost. Because volumes 3 and 5 of a 5-volume set did not wander off independently, she took her notebook to the reading table and sat down. She wrote, Gessner, Historia Animalium. 1551, vols 3 and 5 absent. Not in disposal record. No record of removal. Last register inspection 18 months prior. Estimated value. She stopped. She did not know the exact figure. She wrote, significant, then she sat with her pen in her hand and looked at what she had built over 4 weeks. 31 entries marked with a small cross in the margin, 31 volumes absent from their registered positions. 31 instances of money that had gone somewhere it was not recorded as going. And now 2 more that had not even been recorded as gone. She was not surprised. That was the thing she turned over in her mind as she sat there in the cold library with the afternoon light going yellow against the shelves. She was not surprised because she had known, from the second week, that this was where the evidence was pointing. She had been moving toward it one entry at a time. And now she had arrived. What she did not know was what to do about it. She was Eleanor Moore. She had been Eleanor Moore for 11 months, since the night she had left her uncle's house with 15 shillings, her father's Bible, and a set of borrowed references signed in a name she had not entirely invented. She was here because no one had thought to look for her here. She was here because she needed to remain invisible for 3 years, and the best possible version of invisible was a quiet, competent woman in a large house doing a job that no one else wanted, producing no trouble, attracting no attention. A companion who accused the estate's agent of theft was not invisible. A companion who was investigated as a result of making such an accusation was not invisible. She put the pen down. She picked it up again. I and the margin beside the Gessner entry. She wrote one small letter. G. Then she closed the notebook and put it in her pocket and went back to the east wall and continued the catalogue. She said nothing. She had been saying nothing her whole life. She was very good at it. She told herself it was the correct decision. She was almost certain it was the correct deck. It was the middle of the 4th week when Eleanor first understood what the library had cost him. She had been working late. She often worked late, because the house was quieter after 10 and she could think more clearly without the sound of the household moving around her. She had a single lamp on the reading table and the window cracked open despite the cold because the damp smell accumulated otherwise. And she was working through the West Walls section of cartography and travel when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. They stopped at the door. She did not look up immediately. Footsteps stopped at the door, sometimes a housemaid passing, or Dorset making his last round of the ground floor. But these footsteps did not continue. They remained outside for long enough that the silence became a different quality of silence. And she looked up. The Duke was standing in the doorway. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the room, at the shelves, at the reading table, at the lamp she had placed on the far end to illuminate the cartography section. He was dressed as though he had been to dinner somewhere and come back. Or perhaps as though he had simply not thought about what he was wearing since this morning. His face had the particular stillness of someone who has arrived somewhere he did not intend to go and has not yet decided whether to stay or retreat. Eleanor set her pen down. Your Grace. He came in one step. Then he stopped again. The window is open, he said, for the damp, sir. I can close it in an O. He looked at the shelves. Cecily always had it open. She said a library needed to breathe. He was quiet for a moment. I told her it was eccentric. Eleanor said nothing. She had learned, in 4 weeks, that his silences were not the same as pauses. They were places he went and sometimes came back from and sometimes did not, and interrupting them produced nothing useful. She sat there. He said. He was looking at the chair near the window, the high-backed chair where the Dowager had been sitting on Eleanor's first day, but that was not, she now understood. The dowager's chair. It had always been near the window. She would bring in half the garden if the season was right. Flowers in the inkwell. She claimed it helped her concentrate. He looked at the chair for another moment. It made no sense. But the flowers were always there. Eleanor looked at the chair. She had catalogued the books on the shelves nearest it. They were the most heavily annotated volumes in the library, margins dense with small, round handwriting that had required her to acquire a magnifying lens from the housekeeper's workroom. She had not said anything about the annotations to anyone. She had written in her catalogue, heavily annotated, hand unidentified, because she had not been asked to identify it. And because whatever she said about those annotations would open something that she was not certain she had the right to open, the cartography section, the Duke said. Looking at the shelves she was working on. She was working through that last winter. She had a project she was trying to establish which of the maps were accurate to their date and which had been copied from earlier sources and presented as original surveys. He paused. She wrote to a fellow at the Royal Society about it. He wrote back. She was very pleased that he said it flatly. The way a person recites a fact they have repeated to themselves so many times that the words have worn smooth, she sounds, Eleanor said carefully. Like someone who knew how to make a library work for her, she knew how to make everything work. He turned the phrase over. That sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. She knew how to. She looked at something that was broken and saw what it needed. Not what it would take to fix it. It needed. There's a difference, Eleanor thought, yes. There is, she did not say it. She looked at the cartography section, at the map folios stacked on the lower shelf, at the small flagged notes tucked between certain of them in Cecily's round hand. She left markers in some of the map folios. Eleanor said. I haven't moved them. He looked at her. I thought they might have meant something, Eleanor said. I didn't know if you'd want them left. He was quiet for long enough that she began to think she had said the wrong thing. Leave them, he said. Yes. Sir. He looked at the room for another moment. He seemed to be about to say something, and then to decide against it, and then the decision reversed itself. She died on a Thursday. He said. In April. I was in London. There were matters that he stopped. There were matters. I stayed a week longer than I had meant to. My man of business said they were urgent. He looked at the window. I have never been able to recall, since. What any of them were. Eleanor sat with her pen in her hand and did not move. She was already gone when I reached the North Road, he said. Dorset had sent a man to meet me at the junction. He was waiting there. He stopped again. Then, I have not been in this room since. I know. Sir. He looked at her then quickly, as if she had said something unexpected. Which she had, she supposed. She had not said "I'm sorry," which was what people said, and which the dowager had told her on the first day was the least useful sentence in the language. She had said something that meant, I see you. I have seen, from the evidence of what you left and what you locked and what you gave away, exactly what this room is to you. And I am not going to pretend I don't know. He did not respond to it directly. He was a man who did not respond to things directly. But he looked at her for a moment in a way that was different from the way he usually looked at her when their paths crossed, which was rarely and by accident. And always with the expression of a man encountering a piece of furniture that has moved of its own accord. This look was less like that. The window. He said. You may keep it open. Then he left. Eleanor sat for a while after the sound of his footsteps had gone. Then she looked at the chair by the window. She looked at it for a long time, then she picked up her pen and went back to the cartography section. And worked until the lamp began to gutter, and did not close the window. The box was small and carved from walnut, dark with age, the lid worn smooth at the edges where many hands had lifted it. The dowager set it on the table between them without ceremony. Open it. She said. Eleanor opened it. Inside, on a bed of blue velvet that had faded to the color of a winter sky, lay a ring of keys. A dozen of them, perhaps more, iron and brass both, worn bright at the wards from long use. threaded on a steel ring that had been mended once at the joint with a twist of copper wire. They were not decorative. They were working keys, the kind that fit deep locks in thick doors. And they had the particular quality of objects that have been useful for so long that usefulness has become their nature. Eleanor knew what they were. A woman raised to run a house knows a housekeeper's keys the way a navigator knows a compass, not by being told, but by recognition. These were Cecily's, the dowager said. And before her, her mother's. And before that, her grandmother's. And the one before that, going back to the year this house was built, and a woman whose name I have forgotten but whose competence I have not. She did not touch the keys. They hung on a hook beside the still room door from the time the house was new. When Cecily died, Grimshaw took them off that hook and locked them in the estate office. He told my grandson they required safekeeping. My grandson was not, at that point, in a condition to disagree. Eleanor looked at the keys. That I have retrieved them, the dowager said, in a tone that closed the question of how. I am 81 years old, and I have survived 4 monarchs and 2 marriages, and I have my methods. And they are not your concern. She folded her ruined hands in her lap. They are yours now. Not the still room hook, yours. On your person. On a chatelaine at your waist where the whole house can see them and know who carries them, your grace. Eleanor said. I am a librarian. You are whatever is most useful to this house, the dowager said. And what is most useful to this house at this moment is a woman who holds these keys and is seen to hold them. The county will talk. She looked at Eleanor with the directness of someone who has long since stopped caring what that sentence is supposed to threaten. The county may do as it likes. I.D. not survive what I have survived, to be managed by a girl who gentled a Linnaeus in a flood and then worries about what the county will say. Eleanor looked at the keys again. They were heavier than they looked. She could tell that from the way they sat in the velvet, the weight of them pressing the fabric flat. Grimshaw will. Grimshaw, said the dowager, will find that the situation has changed. That is precisely the point. She pushed the box a fraction of an inch toward Eleanor. You have been running this library for 5 weeks with no authority beyond my word and your own 2 hands. The library is already less of a disaster than it was. The cattle Og is more than half complete. The window is open. A brief pause. My grandson mentioned the window. He did not say it was a bad thing. Eleanor picked up the keys. They were cold from sitting in the box, and then they were warm from her hand, and the shift happened quickly. The way warmth always moves into metal that is ready to receive it. There is a chatelaine in the top drawer of the dressing table in your room, the dowager said. It was Cecily's also. I had it put there last week. I assumed you would say yes. You assumed a great deal, ma'am. That I have found, said Petronella, Dowager Duchess of Northwell, with something that was not quite a smile but lived in the same part of her face. That assuming a great deal saves considerable time. I am 81. Time is a thing I can no longer afford to waste. Eleanor threaded the keys onto the chatelaine that evening in her room, each one in order by size. The way she had seen housekeepers do it in the houses of her childhood, the houses that had still been houses then, before everything had been sold or lost or given away to people who did not deserve it. The chatelaine was silver, plain, not ornamental. It had a working quality that matched the keys. She fastened it at her waist. The keys shifted and settled and hung quiet. The next morning she walked down the main corridor to the library, and the keys made a small sound with every step, not loud, not deliberate. Just present. Constant. The sound of something in its right place. Fitch, the under-secretary, heard her coming from 20 feet away and held a door open for her without being asked. Mrs. Granger, the housekeeper, who had maintained a careful neutrality in all matters relating to the library, paused at the top of the kitchen stairs and watched Eleanor pass with an expression that recalculated something. Grimshaw heard it too. Eleanor did not see his face when he heard it. But she was at the library door when she heard his footsteps stop in the corridor behind her. And she did not turn around. And after a moment his footsteps continued in a different direction. She unlocked the library and went in. the keys were heavier than they looked. She had already decided that was not a bad thing. Victoria Sedley arrived on a Tuesday in the third week of Eleanor's second month. In a carriage that was newer than the woman inside it and considerably better maintained. Eleanor saw the carriage from the library window. She did not know whose it was. But she noted it with the automatic attention she gave to anything new in the forecourt, a habit she had acquired in the last year of always knowing what was arriving, and from which direction, and whether it required her to be somewhere other than where she was. She learned who it was from Prue. The younger housemaid, who had a gift for information and a generous policy regarding its distribution. Miss Sedley, Prue said, appearing at the library door with an armful of clean dusting cloths. Well, Mrs. Sedley, she was married, but she's been widowed these 6 years. The Duke's cousin. On his father's side. She comes when she likes and stays as long as she likes, and nobody says anything about it because she's family and she's got nowhere else particularly to be. She hear often, more since Miss Cecily passed. Prue set the cloths on the table. Miss Cecily didn't much like her. If you don't mind me saying. She was always very correct about it. Miss Cecily was very polite, but you could tell. Mrs. Sedley has a way of looking at things like she's pricing them. Eleanor filed this and returned to the catalogue. She met Victoria Sedley that afternoon at the Dowager's tea. The Dowager held tea at 4 o'clock in the south parlour, which was the only consistently warm room in the house, and she had made it plain in the second week that Eleanor's attendance was not optional. You are not furniture, she had said. Furniture does not need to be present. You do. Victoria Sedley was handsome in the manner of a woman who had worked at it for long enough that it had become structural. She was perhaps 30. Well dressed in a way that required close attention to achieve and was designed to look effortless. Her eyes were bright and moved constantly, the eyes of someone who has learned to read a room the way Eleanor had learned to read a shelf, looking for the valuable items. Noting the gaps, she looked at Eleanor with those eyes and smiled. Miss Moore. She turned the name on her tongue with the delicacy of someone testing a piece of silverware for hallmark. How interesting. Are you a Northern Moore? I seem to recall there are Moores in Westmoreland, a perfectly respectable family, I believe, though I confess I can't place the branch stem why father was a clergyman. Eleanor said. North Yorkshire. There's no particular family to place that a clergyman's daughter. Victoria's smile did not waver. How industrious you must be, then. I understand you've been cataloguing the library, all those hundreds of books. One admires the patience it must require. And the Latin. Of course. I imagine a great many of them are in Latin. A fair proportion. Yes, that I studied Latin as a girl, Victoria said pleasantly. I found I had entirely forgotten it within 2 years of leaving the schoolroom. One does, doesn't one? When there's no practical occasion to use it. She sipped her tea. I suppose in your situation the practical occasions are rather more present. The Dowager, from her chair, made a sound that was not a cough. Eleanor looked at Victoria Sedley with the level, unhurried attention she gave to a document she was trying to date, taking in all the available evidence before drawing any conclusion. The Latin is the easier part, Eleanor said. It's the Greek that requires attention. Something moved in Victoria's eyes. It was not respect. Exactly. It was the recalibration of an estimate. How impressive, she said, and her voice had flattened very slightly, the pleasantness becoming more deliberate. You must be very useful to the Dowager. That I hope so. Ma'am, the tea continued. Victoria spoke of London and the season and a cousin's recent marriage with the easy fluency of a woman who had been performing sociability for so long it required no conscious effort. She asked the Dowager about her health with attentive warmth. She asked the Duke, who appeared briefly and consumed his tea standing by the fireplace in the manner of a man fulfilling an obligation, about the autumn shooting, and received monosyllables in return. And appeared to find this entirely satisfactory. She did not ask Eleanor anything else directly. But she watched her. Eleanor, who had spent 11 months developing a refined sensitivity to being watched, felt the attention like weather, not hostile yet, not precisely, but the kind of weather that was deciding what it intended to become. That evening, returning from the library at dusk, Eleanor passed the east terrace. Victoria Sedley was on the terrace. She was not alone. Grimshaw stood beside her with his hands clasped behind him in his customary attitude of administrative helpfulness. Their voices were low. Eleanor caught nothing of what was said. She was not close enough. And she did not slow her pace, because slowing her pace would have been noticed, and she had no desire to be noticed doing this particular thing. But she saw the angle of their heads, the slight lean of conspiratorial proximity. The way Grimshaw nodded once with the careful nod of a man confirming an agreement. She kept walking that eye in her room. She sat at the small desk where she kept her notebook and opened it to the current working page. She did not write anything about what she had seen on the terrace. She was not certain enough of what it meant to commit it to paper, but she sat for a while, thinking about Victoria Sedley's eyes moving across the library pricing, the housemaid had said, and about the way Grimshaw had nodded. And she thought about the fact that Victoria had, within 4 hours of arriving, established Eleanor's family background, her education, her length of tenure, and her specific duties. She thought, she is not curious about me. She is assessing me. Then she thought, she is afraid of something. She closed the notebook. She looked at the ring of keys on the chatelaine hanging from the hook beside the door. Then she opened the notebook again and, in very small letters in the margin of the current page, she wrote, "Vs. What does she need this house to be?" She did not yet have the answer. But she had learned, in a year of keeping careful records, that writing down the right question was always the first step. The book was not where it should have been. Eleanor found it on a Tuesday morning in the 6th week, misfiled in the moral philosophy section behind a row of a small octavo volume, dark green boards. The spine label written in Cecily's round hand. She almost passed it over. Then she read the title. On the obligations of the knowing. A treatise on moral responsibility and conditions of partial information. She stood on the library ladder with the book in her hand for a moment. Then she came down and took it to the reading table. It was annotated throughout. Cecily had read it at least twice. There were 2 layers of pencil mark S, the second set darker and more urgent than the first, as though she had returned to it with a specific purpose. The margins of the early chapters held the usual responses, questions, cross-references. The occasional word of agreement or dispute written in small neat letters. But in the middle section, the annotations became longer, denser. They stopped being responses to the text and started being something else. Eleanor read slowly. The chapter was titled The Culpability of Witnesses. The argument was this: that a person who possesses knowledge of a wrong and chooses not to act on that knowledge bears a portion of the moral weight of the wrong's continuation. Not the same portion as the agent of the wrong, but a portion. Cecily had underlined the central proposition twice. In the margin beside it she had written, "Is silence ever truly neutral? Or does silence, in the presence of active harm, become its own kind of action?" 3 pages later, she had written, "The question is not whether one is afraid. Of course one is afraid. The question is what one does with the fear." And on the last annotated page, in darker pencil, the marks of the second reading: "A person who knows the truth and chooses comfort instead. What are they, exactly? Not a liar. But not innocent either. There must be a word for what they are." Eleanor sat with the book open in her hands and did not move for a long time. Outside the window, the morning was grey and still. The garden below was going toward winter. The flower beds cut back, the paths dark with wet leaves. At the far end of the kitchen garden, visible from this angle through a gap in the yew hedge, was the cottage belonging to the head groundsman. His wife was in the doorway. She had a pot on the step catching the water that came through the roof. And she was adjusting it with the matter-of-fact patience of someone who has been making this adjustment for a long time. Eleanor watched her move the pot. Then move it again, fractionally. As the drip shifted, the roof had been repaired. Eleanor knew this because it was in the estate maintenance accounts. She had seen the record when she was cross-referencing the library repair invoices. Groundsman's cottage roof, repaired and made weathertight. June of last year. The work had been charged to the estate at £32. The woman in the doorway moved the pot again. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment, then she looked down at the book in her hands. A person who knows the truth and chooses comfort instead, she had been telling H.'s elf, for 6 weeks, that it was not her place. That she was here to catalogue the library and nothing more. That she was Eleanor Moore, a clergyman's daughter from North Yorkshire with no connections and no resources and an urgent personal need to remain unnoticed for 3 more years. And that a librarian who accused an estate agent of theft was a librarian who would be investigated, and a librarian who was investigated was a librarian who was found. And a librarian who was found was. She stopped, she sat with the book open on the table and she thought about what she actually was. She was Eleanor Stone. She had £4,000 that she could not touch for 3 more years. She had an uncle who had spent a portion of it and intended to wreck over the remainder by marrying her to a man she would not have, and who had enough legal standing as her trustee to make her life extremely difficult if he located her. She had 11 months of careful invisibility behind her, and she had believed, sincerely, that the correct application of that invisibility was to keep her head down and do her work and not trouble anyone's affairs. She had believed it. She turned the page. Cecily had written, on the last blank leaf of the book, in the darker pencil of the second reading. A single line. Not a response to the text. Just a statement, the kind a person writes when they are trying to be honest with themselves at midnight. The problem with being careful is that eventually you are careful of the wrong thing. Eleanor read it twice, then she closed the book and sat with it under her hands on the table. She could hear, very faintly, the sound of the groundsman's wife moving the pot again as the drip shifted once more. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top she wrote, missing volumes, complete verification. Not the partial list she had been keeping. The complete one. Every discrepancy, every unmatched invoice. Every record that did not agree with the physical reality of the shelves. The whole of it, assembled in one place, in a form that could not be argued with. She had been building it piecemeal, giving herself permission to build only as much as she needed to see the pattern without committing to doing anything about it. She understood now that this had been a form of cowardice dressed as prudence. The pattern was complete. She had known it was complete for 2 weeks. She had been choosing not to finish the record because a finished record required a decision about what to do with it. She picked up her pen, she wrote for 3 hours without stopping. Every entry she had marked with a cross in the catalogue. Every receipt she had cross-referenced against Haverstock's figures. Every voice for work that had not been done. Charged at amounts that did not correspond to any tradesman she had spoken to in Merrill. The Gessner volumes. The missing first editions. The humidity equipment that had never been installed. The cottage roof that had been repaired on paper and was catching rain in a pot as she wrote. When she shed, she had 14 pages in her small close hand. She read them back. She corrected 2 figures. She added a note at the bottom of the last page. All figures above cross-referenced against primary sources. Tradesman accounts verified directly where possible. Physical evidence available on request. She put the pen down. Her hands were steady. She was a little surprised to find that they were steady. She had expected to feel afraid, she felt. Instead, something that it took her a moment to identify because she had not felt it often enough to recognize it quickly. She felt clear. She put the 14 pages in the false bottom of her document case, beneath the catalog sheets, where they had been safe before and would be safe now. She put Cecily's book on the shelf in its correct location in the moral philosophy section, where it had always belonged. Then she took her notebook and went back to the catalog, and worked until the light failed. And did not waste any more time being careful of the wrong thing. That he came to the library that Thursday evening with a book under his arm and no particular explanation, and Eleanor understood from this that he had decided, sometime between the last time she had seen him and now, that the library was a place he was allowed to be again. She did not remark on it. She moved her work to the left half of the reading table and left the right half clear, and he sat down at it without being invited and opened his book. And they worked in companionable silence for the better part of an hour. He was not reading. She noticed this. After 20 minutes he turned pages at intervals that had nothing to do with the length of the text, and twice he turned one back. which suggested he had not retained whatever was on it. But he was present, and the library seemed to take a different quality from his presence. The way a room changes when it is occupied by the person it was built for. Eleanor was working through Cecily's annotation books, the volumes she had set aside because the annotations required the most care to record accurately. There were 11 of them. She had been putting them last. She opened the fourth one, a collection of essays on natural history, mid-century. Cecily had been through it thoroughly. Her marks were on nearly every page. She was copying an annotation from the title page when the Duke set his book down. She catalogued them herself. He said. Before she kept her own records. There was a system. He looked at the shelves. I never learned it. I could never find anything without asking her. Her system is legible. Eleanor said. Once you understand the organizing principle. She catalogued by subject first and then by date within subject. Rather than alphabetically. It takes adjustment, but it's logical. She said alphabetical was a coward's method. The corner of his mouth shifted. She said it told you nothing about the relationship between things. Only about the relationship between the letters of their titles. She was right. He Lu. Ket at Eleanor. You've been reading her annotations that I have to record them accurately. The annotations are part of the catalog entry. What are they like? Eleanor considered the question. She looked at the essay collection open in front of her, at the dense pencil marks on the title page. At the particular quality of Cecily's handwriting, the roundness of it that had nothing soft in it, the way the letters pressed firmly into the paper. Argumentative, she said. She disagreed with a great many authors. She was respectful about it. But she disagreed clearly, and she gave her reasons. She paused. She also asked a great many questions in the margins. Not rhetorical questions, actual questions she seemed to want answered. There's one in a lock, she wrote with an asterisk. And then 3 pages later another asterisk, and the answer she'd worked out herself. The Duke was quiet for a moment. She did that in letters too. She would ask me something in the first paragraph and answer it herself by the fourth. And then say she had only asked me because she wanted to see if I would reach the same conclusion. He stopped. I usually did. She said that meant we thought alike. I told her it meant she had simply led me there. A pause. She said those were the same thing. Eleanor did not speak. She had learned the quality of the pauses he needed. That I have letters I haven't read, he said. From the spring. She wrote to me in March twice, I think, and I was in London and I meant to reply when I came back. And then I came back and he stopped. The letters were mislaid in the confusion afterward. Dorset found them in September and gave them to me. I haven't opened them. No, Eleanor said that I know what she would say about that. He said. She would say I was being a coward. She had no patience with people who chose not to know things. Eleanor thought of the dark pencil in the margin. The problem with being careful is that eventually you are careful of the wrong thing. She did not say it. It was not hers to give him. She would say, the Duke continued, that whatever is in the letters is only information, and that information cannot be worse than imagination, which fills the space with everything possible at once. He turned his book over in his hands. She would be right. She was usually right. I found it easier to hear when she was the one saying it. That I think, Eleanor said carefully. That you already know you'll open them. The question is only when. He looked at her. Not the brief, furniture-encountering look. The longer one that had become, over the past weeks, its own kind of conversation. Cecily would have liked you. He said. Eleanor was not prepared for this. She looked down at the annotation book. She had no patience with people who talked around things. He said. She always said what she meant. She thought it was a moral obligation. A pause. I told her it was occasionally inconvenient. She said that was the point, that it is occasionally inconvenient. Eleanor said, yes. Something in his face shifted. You would have argued with each other constantly, probably. she would have enjoyed it enormously. Eleanor looked at the annotation in front of her, the asterisk, the question. The answer 3 pages later. She thought about a young woman sitting in this room alone working out answers to her own questions and pressing the letters firmly into the paper so they would last. That I think, she said. I would have enjoyed it too. The fire had gone low. Neither of them had tended it. The library held the warmth of it still, the good warmth of a room that has been occupied all evening, and the books were dark on the shelves around them, and the window was open 2 inches as it always was now. And the faint cold of the night came through it and balanced the warmth of the room into something exactly right. She wrote to me about the maps. The Duke said. In one of the last letters I did read. She said she'd found 3 in the collection that were being presented as original surveys and were in fact copies. She could tell because the coastline errors were identical. She said the original cartographer must have been working from hearsay in places and the copier had duplicated the mistakes without understanding that they were mistakes. He looked at the shelves. I wrote back that I couldn't imagine how she could tell. She said she'd write and explain it. That was March. He was quiet. I expect the explanation is in one of the unopened letters that it will keep, Eleanor said. Until you're ready. That he looked at her for a moment. Then he stood, and collected his unread book, and said good night with the brevity of a man who has run out of words but not, quite, out of the desire for company. After he left, Eleanor sat for a while with Cecily's annotation book open on the table in front of her and the fire at its last warmth and the window open exactly 2 inches. Then she reached into the pocket of her dress and found, still there where she had put it in the 7th week and not yet returned to its shelf, a small piece of deep red ribbon cut cleanly, an inch long. The kind of bookmark made by a person who treated books as things worth marking carefully. She had found it loose in the spine of the moral philosophy book. She had meant to replace it. She held it for a moment. Then she put it back in her pocket, and went to bank the fire. And left the window open, and took her lamp and went upstairs. The letter from Grimshaw was on the library table when Eleanor arrived at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday morning in her 10th week at Lark Court. That it was not a long letter. It informed her, in the smooth administrative prose of a man who had written many such letters, that her services in the library were no longer required as of that day, that a review of her conduct had identified certain irregularities in her access to estate documents beyond the scope of her position, and that she should present herself to the housekeeper by noon to arrange the return of any keys in her possession and the settlement of her final wages. Eleanor read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket. She stood in the library for a moment at the reading table with its neat ROWs of catalogue sheets, at the shelves that now held every volume in its correct position with its condition recorded to 3 decimal points of precision. At the window open its customary 2 inches with the autumn light coming through it clean and level. She had been in this room for 10 weeks. She knew where every book. Saturday she picked up her document case. She went downstairs. The forecourt was louder than usual for a Wednesday morning. She heard the carriage before she reached the front door, wheels on gravel, a horse blowing. The particular sound of a vehicle that has traveled some distance and arrived with purpose. She came out onto the steps. The carriage was hired. It was dusty from the road. The man coming out of it was red-faced and broad and wore a plum-colored coat that had been expensive some years ago. And he moved with the particular momentum of someone who has been rehearsing what he intends to say for the length of a 4-hour journey. Eleanor went still on the steps. Silas Stone, her uncle, her father's brother, her trustee. The man who held £4,000 of her money in an account she had last seen itemized 2 years ago and suspected bore very little resemblance to its original contents, planted his feet on the gravel of Lark Court forecourt and looked up at her with the expression of a man who has spent 11 months being inconvenienced and has finally arrived at the source of the inconvenience. There you are, he said. The satisfaction in his voice was enormous. There you are, you ungrateful girl. Do you have any idea what you have cost me in post horses? Eleanor said nothing. She was calculating. She had perhaps 40 seconds before the situation became unmanageable. She used them. Grimshaw had appeared in the doorway to the left. She registered him without looking at him directly. Victoria Sedley was coming from the direction of the garden. A letter in her hand. her face arranged in the expression of a woman performing reluctant duty. Dorset was at the far end of the entrance hall. The two housemaids who had been cleaning the front windows were frozen in place on either side of the door, and the Duke came down the steps that he had heard the carriage from High's study. He came out because a strange carriage in his forecourt was his business, as it always had been. He came down the steps in his shirt sleeves, which meant he had come quickly. And he stopped 2 steps above the gravel and looked at the scene below him with the expression of a man who has walked into a room and found it substantially different from how he left it. His eyes went to Eleanor first. She was standing on the steps with her document case under her arm and her chatelaine at her waist and her face giving nothing away, which was a face he had learned to read well enough to know that it was giving a great deal away to anyone who knew how to look. Then his eyes went to the red-faced man in the plum coat. "What," the Duke said, in the voice that 10 weeks ago had ordered a horse shot, "is the meaning of this that it all came out then, and it came out badly?" As such things do when several people have been holding separate pieces of information and release them all at once. Silas Stone was delighted to find a Duke. He addressed himself entirely to the Duke, with the instinct of a man who has always understood that the correct strategy is to appeal to the highest available authority. He laid out his case with the practiced fluency of someone who had been composing it for 4 hours in a hired carriage. "His niece, Eleanor Stone, not more, Your Grace. Stone, she has been using a false name, was his ward, the daughter of his late brother, and was the beneficiary of a trust of £4,000 currently under his honest management. She had run from his house the previous autumn without warning or explanation, abandoning her duty to her family and to her father's memory. She had hidden herself in service under a false name. She had deceived this household and this Duke, who had unknowingly been harboring a deceitful, fortune-hiding girl who had lied her way under his roof." Victoria stepped forward at exactly the right moment, with exactly the expression of a woman doing something she found distasteful but necessary. "That I am afraid it's true, cousin," she said. "I had concerns over the past weeks. Her manner, her knowledge, things that didn't quite. I made some inquiries, for the household's protection." She held out the letter. "Her name is Stone. She has £4,000 she failed to mention. And she has been, as Mr. Stone says, using a false direction." A pause. Perfectly weighted. One does wonder what else she might have concealed. Her access to the estate documents, for instance. One wonders what she might have been looking for. Every face in the forecourt turned to Eleanor. The Duke was looking at her. She watched him read the situation, watched him arrive at the calculation that Victoria intended him to arrive at. The calculation that placed Eleanor's access to the estate accounts and Eleanor's hidden fortune and Eleanor's false name in the same category of deliberate deception. She watched the library door close behind his eyes. That it was a strange thing, she found, to have dreaded a moment for 11 months and to arrive in it and discover that the dread had gone. She had spent her entire adult life being invisible in order to be safe. And here was safety ending, in a forecourt, in front of everyone. And the sky had not fallen, there was only the truth left. And the truth, at least, was simple. "Everything this gentleman has said is accurate," she said, her voice carried clearly across the gravel. She had not raised it. She did not need to. "My name is Eleanor Stone. My father died when I was 21 and left me £4,000 in trust, with this gentleman as trustee. I left his house last autumn because he intended me to marry his son in order to consolidate the trust into his own accounts, an intention the trust accounts will demonstrate he had already begun to act on." She looked at Silas Stone directly. He had the grace to read. And further, "I came here under my mother's family name, which is more. I told the Dowager Duchess I was an orphan without prospects, which is true. Money you cannot touch until you are 25 is not a prospect. It is a calendar." She paused. "I concealed the fortune. I did not conceal it to deceive this house. I concealed it to survive." She turned to the Duke. She was aware, distantly, of Grimshaw in the doorway and Victoria with her letter and her uncle on the gravel and the 2 housemaids at the windows and Dorset in the hall. She was aware of all of them. She looked at the Duke. "That I have copied your estate accounts," she said. "Mrs. Sedley is correct in that. I have been doing so for 3 months. I have the results in this case." She set the document case on the step between them. "They are fair copies, complete, and cross-referenced against primary sources. The tradesman accounts are verified. The tenant's statements are witnessed. The physical evidence is present and available." She opened the document case. She took out the 14 pages she had written in the 7th week and every subsequent edition, assembled now into a single document held with a black ribbon. She set it on the case, the missing volumes from the library collection, 33 in total, including 2 from the Gessner Historia Animalium, which were removed without any record of disposal or sale. The invoice for the humidity control equipment that has never been unpacked. The repair to the groundsman's cottage roof that was charged to the estate at £32 and not carried out. The roof is currently receiving rain through at least 4 separate failures. The falsified tradesman accounts. She looked at him steadily. "You are being robbed, sir. You have been being robbed for at least 3 years. I can demonstrate it completely in the space of an afternoon." The forecourt was silent. Grimshaw laughed. It was a soft sound, almost gentle. The laugh of a man indicating that something is too absurd to require a serious response. It was precisely the wrong response. A man does not laugh at a true account. The laugh told everyone present that he knew the account was true and had decided that his only remaining option was to make the WOM. And who had compiled it seem ridiculous. That it did not work. The Duke was not looking at Grimshaw. He was looking at the document on the step. Then he looked at Eleanor, not as he had looked at her on the first day. The look of a man encountering an unexpected bill. The look of a man who has been underwater for a long time and has just seen, unambiguously, the direction of the surface. "Show me," he said. "They did it in the library." Because Eleanor had asked that it be done there and the Duke had agreed without asking why. She knew why. The library was where the evidence had been built. It was the correct room. It took the remainder of that day and the first hours of the evening. Dorset was sent to Marrow for the tradesmen. They came in the late afternoon, uncomfortable in their Sunday coats. Standing in the long room among 2 centuries of books with the particular unease of people summoned to a great house and uncertain whether they are there as witnesses or defendants. Eleanor had spoken to each of them before. They knew her. They brought their own records. The chandler first. His account showed what he had charged the estate for the past 3 years, week by week, in his own hand. Eleanor put her cross-referenced figures beside it on the reading table. The numbers agreed. The numbers did not agree with Grimshaw's estate accounts, which showed a sum consistently higher by a margin of 8 to 12%, the glazier next. Then the carpenter who had been engaged for the library's shelving repairs that had been paid for, he confirmed, and then cancelled, and the money had not been returned. And he had assumed it was an accounting matter above his station to pursue. Haverstock arrived last, from Marrow, with his acquisition records. He stood before the reading table with his hat in his hands and identified, one by one, the volumes he had purchased from the estate agent. He gave the prices. He gave the dates. He had, he said, kept careful records because the transactions had seemed to him irregular, and a man in his position found it wise to keep careful records of irregular transactions. Dorset brought Amos, the head groundsman, who confirmed what the weather had confirmed for 14 months, that the cottage roof had not been touched by any workman at any point since the previous survey, which had noted it required significant repair, throughout all of it. Grimshaw sat in the far corner with his hands clasped and his face going through a series of adjustments from smooth denial through considered reappraisal to the fixed expression of a man who has run out of adaptations and arrived at simple endurance, when the tradesmen had given their accounts and been thanked and shown out by Dorset. The Duke sent for the estate ledgers. Grimshaw said, "The young woman's figures contain a number of misapprehensions. Estate accounting is a specialized both books," the Duke said to Dorset. Grimshaw went quiet. The 2 ledgers came. One clean. One worn at the corners. Eleanor had not been in the estate office since the 7th week, when she had made her decision. She had not needed to go back. Everything she had needed she had built from the outside in. From doors and tally sticks and the honest records of people who had not known they were building a case, the Duke opened the worn ledger on the table beside Eleanor's 14 pages that he read in silence. Eleanor stood at the end of the table and watched him read. She did not help him. He did not help. He was, as his grandmother had said, not a fool. He was a man who had chosen not to read, which was a different thing entirely, and he was reading now with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the time for not reading is finished. That he turned pages. The fire had been lit. And the room was warm, and the candles on the reading table were good ones that burned without guttering, and the light was clear and even. That he read for a long time. When he finished, he set his hand flat on the worn ledger. He sat with his hand on it for a moment. Eleanor watched his face and thought, there it is. That is the moment he understands not just the money but the time. 3 years. Every month of the 3 years since Cecily died, she kept these. He said. Not to Eleanor. Not to Grimshaw. To the room, or to himself. Or to the east wing upstairs where the door was still shut. She kept them fair. She knew what was going into these accounts and she made sure they were accurate. He looked at the clean ledger beside the worn one. I never opened them after April. I couldn't open them. Her hand was on every page. He lifted his hand from the cover. When he spoke again his voice had gone flat and very quiet. The flatness of something controlled precisely because it cannot afford not to be controlled. I signed what was put in front of me because looking at the accounts meant looking at her work and I could not look at her work. No one in the room said anything. You will leave Lark Court tonight. The Duke said to Grimshaw. The quietness did not change. You will present yourself at the Marrow Magistrate's office tomorrow morning. Every figure this lady has recorded will accompany you. If you have a shilling of my tenant's money remaining, you will restore it. If you have not, the law will provide the next instruction. Grimshaw stood. He had the smoothness back. Briefly, one last adaptation. The young woman came to this house under a false name, he said. Whatever she's produced was produced by someone with every reason to. Dorset. The Duke said. See him off the estate. Watch him pack. Dorset moved. At the library door. Grimshaw turned. The smoothness was gone entirely. What was under it was not pleasant and had never been. He looked at Eleanor with the directness of a man who no longer has anything to manage and does not bother. You couldn't simply keep to the books, he said. No. Eleanor said. I never could. He left. Dorset followed. The library was very quiet. Eleanor began to gather her pages from the table, the 14 pages and the additions, 3 months of careful work, and stack them into order. Her hands were steady. She had thought, at various points over the past weeks, about what this moment would feel like. She had imagined relief, or vindication, or the particular satisfaction of a sum that has finally come right. She found she felt none of these. Or perhaps all of them at once in such equal measure that they cancelled each other into a clean, functional calm. Victoria had not been removed. She sat in the corner chair where she had been for the last 2 hours, her letter gone to a crushed thing in her lap. Her face composed and her hands not quite still. She was a woman who had spent the last 2 hours watching a machine she had helped to build come apart piece by piece in the candlelight, and she was not going to be the first to speak. The Duke looked at her. You knew? He said. It was not entirely a question. That I knew that Grimshaw's accounts were convenient. Victoria said. Her voice was bright and brittle and entirely steady. I knew that certain debts of mine in the county were being settled through the estate. I didn't ask how. I thought it wise not to ask how. She met his eyes. You're going to tell me that is the same as participation? That it is the same as participation? Yes. She did not look away. I expect you want me to leave. The Duke opened his mouth. Your Grace, Eleanor said. That he looked at her. Something in her voice had asked him to wait, and he had learned, over 10 weeks. That when that voice asked him to wait it was worth waiting. She didn't falsify the ledgers, Eleanor said. She didn't sell the books. She knew about the river of money going somewhere it shouldn't. And she was quiet about it, which is precisely what I did for 6 weeks and I am in no position to hang anyone for. She looked at Victoria steadily. There is the small dower house at the edge of the park. It has been empty since spring. A woman might live in it on 100 a year and be answerable to no one. And stop having to calculate the cost of every meal she accepts in someone else's house. She paused. It would be on no condition at all. I want that understood. Victoria stared at her. She had been prepared for justice. Just as she understood, she had been calculating its probable terms since the herd tradesman had opened his records. She had not been prepared for this, and it undid her the way justice would not have. Her face did something she clearly had not intended it to do, and then composed itself again, and the composure was more honest than anything she had shown all evening. Why? She said. The word came out plain, without ornament, because I know exactly how tiring it is, Eleanor said. And because a house that has just put out one thief should not mark the occasion by making a beggar. The fire settled. The candles burned. Victoria looked at Eleanor for a long time. And then she looked at the Duke, and then she looked at her own hands in her lap. The dower house, she said. I would. She stopped. Then, yes. If his grace permits it. The Duke looked at Eleanor. His expression was one she had not seen before on his face, not the closed look, not the drowning look. But something that had been shut since April, opening quietly in the candlelight, like a window that has been painted shut for long enough that when it finally gives the sound it makes is very small. The dower house, he said, is available. The open library day had been Cecily's invention. She had begun it in her second year of managing the collection, on the premise that a library locked behind a great house's doors was a library being wasted, and that waste was, in her considered opinion, a moral failing. Once a year. In late autumn, when the harvest was in and the county had time to breathe, she had opened Lark Court's doors to anyone who wished to come: tenant farmers and their wives, the schoolmaster from Marrow, the curate, the doctor, tradesmen who had heard there were maps, young women who had heard there were novels. She had spent the week before each opening in a state of focused preparation that the Duke had found baffling and the Dowager had found entirely recognizable. It had not happened for 2 years. The Dowager announced it from her chair on the 1st of October, 3 weeks after Grimshaw's departure, with the tone of a woman issuing a correction to a long-running administrative error. The library is in order, she said. The house is in order. There is no reason to continue behaving as though we are in mourning for a building. Eleanor opened the great rooms. She had the holland covers struck from the furniture and the shutters folded back from windows that had been closed so long the light came in tentatively, as though uncertain of its welcome. She set the housemaids to work on the floors and the candleholders. She had the reading tables in the library set with the catalogue, her catalogue, fair copied into a bound volume by her own hand, open at the first page, so that visitors could see the shape of the collection before they entered it. She filled the library with late roses from the walled garden, a thing she had not planned to do and found herself doing on the morning of the day itself, with the dew still on her shoes. Because the room wanted something living in it, and because it was the kind of thing that Cecily, she had come to understand, would have done, she set candles in all the sconces along the gallery, good beeswax candles, 50 of them. The kind that burned clean and long without guttering. She had had the sconces cleaned herself, weeks ago, against exactly this occasion, without quite admitting to herself that she was planning for it. She wore a gown she had not worn at Lark Court before, dark blue wool, simply cut, with no ornament except the chatelaine at her waist. She had pressed it the night before with the focused attention she brought to any task she intended to do properly. The visitors came at 2 o'clock. There were more of them than she had anticipated. Word had spread in Marrow and beyond that the library was open, that the collection was extraordinary, that the new librarian had put it in order and knew where everything was and would answer questions without condescension. The schoolmaster came with 4 of his older students. The doctor brought his wife and his daughter. Haverstock came with his son, and stood before the natural philosophy section with an expression of undisguised pleasure, running his eyes along the spines as though greeting old acquaintances. Amos arrived with 3 tenant families, including the groundsman's wife, whose cottage roof had been repaired in October by the man who was actually paid to repair it, at the cost that appeared in the accounts and nowhere else. She stood in the library door for a long moment before she came in, looking at the shelves with the expression of someone who has been told a thing is beautiful and has arrived to find that the description was not adequate. Eleanor moved through the room and answered questions and pointed out the cartography section and showed the schoolmaster's students how the ca. Talogue worked and explained to the doctor's daughter, who wanted to know, that the annotation system in the natural philosophy section had been developed by the previous librarian and was, in Eleanor's view, the most intelligent organizational intelligence the collection possessed. She was in the upper gallery, checking that the candles in the far sconces were drawing correctly, when she became aware that the room below had shifted in character. It was not loud. It was, if anything, quieter than it had been. But the quality of the quiet was different, the particular quiet of a room full of people who have collectively noticed something and are watching it. She looked down. The Duke had come in. He was not dressed for a public occasion. He had come from wherever he had been, his study, probably, or the East Wing, and he was in his working clothes, and he had come in through the side door that connected the library to the private corridor. Which meant he had not planned to appear among the visitors. He had simply arrived. He stopped just inside the door and looked at the room. Eleanor watched him look at it. She saw the moment he understood what had been done, not just the candles and the roses and the people, but the catalogue on the table and the sconces cleaned and the shelves ordered and the smell of beeswax instead of mold and the groundsman's wife standing in the doorway of a room she had apparently never entered in 20 years of living on the estate, looking at the books as though they were a landscape she had not known existed. He stood in the doorway for a long time, then he crossed the room. He crossed the whole length of it from the side door to the gallery stairs, through the middle of the visitors, who parted for him with the automatic deference of people making way for a duke, and then turned, one by one, to watch where he was going. He climbed the gallery stairs without hurrying. He came along the upper gallery to where Eleanor was standing by the far sconces with a taper in her hand. He stopped in front of her. The gallery was above the room. Below them, 50 candles burned and late roses filled the air with something between sweetness and cold, and 2 years of closed shutters had become one evening of ordinary, inhabited light. The county was watching. Eleanor was aware of the county watching in the way she was aware of the candles, as a fact of the room rather than as a pressure on herself. The Duke looked at her in the way he had been looking at her since the library door had opened, in his eyes on the eye of the forecourt, steadily, without the drowning quality, with something that had no word for it yet but that she had felt accumulating over 3 weeks like a record being quietly compiled. You let it breathe. He said that it was not loud enough for the room below to hear. But the room below could see his face, and the county saw what was on it, and Eleanor would understand later, much later. In the way one understands things that were happening while one was too occupied to notice them, that the county had read it with the accuracy of people who have known a man's face for 30 years and understand exactly what it means when it looks like that. The room wanted to. She said, "No." He shook his head, very slightly. You wanted it to. There's a difference. He looked at the shelves, the candles, the catalogue open on the table below. Cecily used to say that a library doesn't run itself. It needs someone who cares more about the books than about whether anyone notices them caring. He looked at Eleanor. I never knew what she meant until this year. Eleanor said nothing. That I opened the letters. He said. Last week. The ones from March. A pause. She wrote about the maps. 3 pages on the cartographic errors. Exactly as she said she would. She also wrote at the end of the last letter that she thought I worked too hard and came home too seldom, and that she intended to tell me so at length when I returned. He was quiet for a moment. She did not get the chance to tell me at length. No. Eleanor said, but I know what she would have said. I have been thinking about what she would have said for 7 months, and I was wrong about most of it. He looked at her steadily. I thought she would have said, come home sooner. Stay longer. Don't leave for matters that can wait. He paused. What she actually wrote was, "When you come back, I want to show you something in the library. I found 3 maps that are lying about their origins and I think you'll find the proof interesting." Eleanor understood what he was telling her. That Cecily's last letter had not been an accusation. It had been an invitation. She was planning what came in. Eleanor said, "Yes." He let the word rest for a moment. She was always planning what came next. He looked at Eleanor with the open face, the face she had first seen on the night of the forecourt, when the library door in his eyes had begun to come unstuck, and she thought, "There it is. That is what he looks like when he has decided." "Miss Moore," he said, and then corrected himself, "Miss Stone." A pause. "I find I do not know which name to use. My mother's family name is Moore." Eleanor said. "My father's family name is Stone. They were both my parents." "Then perhaps both names are equally yours, perhaps they are." He looked at her for a moment longer. Below them the candles burned and the county watched, and the roses filled the room with their cold sweetness. And the catalogue lay open on the reading table at the first page, at the entry she had written in her own hand for the first volume she had saved from the flood on the first afternoon, Philosophia Botanica. Linnaeus. Amsterdam, 1751. First edition. Condition. Recoverable. "That I am not going to ask you to choose this house," he said. "You have put it in order and it will run without you. And in 3 years you will have £4,000 of your own and no obligation to anyone. I am not going to ask you to choose it because you don't need it." He looked at her. "I am going to ask whether you would choose me. Not the house. Not the position. Not any arrangement that has anything to do with convenience." He stopped. Then, very quietly, "I would like, for the rest of my life, to be looked at by the person who looked at a room full of chaos and saw, before anything else, which books were worth saving." Eleanor stood in the upper gallery of Lark Court Library with 50 candles below her and the county watching and the ribbon bookmark in her pocket where it had been for 3 weeks. And she looked at him. She thought about 11 months of invisibility. She thought about the hired carriage on a wet November morning, and 15 shillings, and a name she had borrowed from her mother. She thought about the dowager in her chair saying, "You are not what I expected." And a first edition of the Linnaeus in floodwater, and a pair of ledgers lying side by side on a reading table, and a dead woman's question in the margin of a book. "The problem with being careful is that eventually you are careful of the wrong thing, Bartholomew." She said. She had never used his name. The gallery heard her use it, and he heard her use it, and what came across his face was worth considerably more than £4,000 in a library and a house full of late roses. "That is a yes," she said, because she had learned, in 10 weeks, that this particular man occasionally required things to be stated plainly. "I will choose you. As yourself." She could not help it. The almost smile was on her own mouth now, the one she had learned from watching his. "On one condition. Name it." "The groundsman's cottage roof was repaired in October," she said. "Properly, by the man who was actually paid to do it. I want that to be the standard." She looked at him steadily. "Every repair, every account, every figure that goes into the estate books from this point, I want them to be accurate. Not convenient. Accurate." The Duke of Northwell looked at the woman who had walked into his library 10 weeks ago in the rain and known, before she had taken off her coat. "Which book was worth saving?" "That I believe," he said, "that you have just described your own job." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I believe I have." Below them the county began, quietly, to understand that it had witnessed something. And the room filled with the particular sound of 50 people simultaneously deciding to tell this story for a very long time. Autumn settled into Lark Court the way it settled into old houses that have stood long enough to have opinions about seasons gradually, without drama. The light shifting by degrees until one morning the quality of it was entirely different and had been that way for some time without anyone having marked the change. By November, Eleanor had been the Duchess of Northwell for 3 weeks, the wedding had been at Lark Court Church, where Cecily lay. On a bright October morning with the Dowager on the Duke's arm and Dorset in the front pew looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who had been correct about something for a very long time and was allowing himself one private moment of satisfaction. Prue wept. Mrs. Granger did no tea weep but stood very straight, which amounted to the same thing, and Victoria came. She sat in the back pew in a grey coat that was plainly new and plainly her own choice, and she did not speak to anyone before the service. And afterward she spoke to the Dowager for several minutes with an expression that Eleanor, watching from across the churchyard, could not fully read. Then she walked back to the Dower house at the park's edge, which she had spent the past month making into something that was, according to Prue, who had been sent to help with the curtains, extremely well organized and already showing signs of a serious commitment to the Dower house's small but neglected library. The Dowager had wept exactly once. Then she had announced that she had reached her limit, and that any woman who had survived 4 monarchs and 2 marriages had earned the right to set her own terms on sentiment, and she had gone in to dinner on her grandson's arm with her spine perfectly straight out on a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week of November. Eleanor was in the library. She was not working. The catalogue was complete, had been complete since October. Bound in 2 volumes and placed in the muniment chest where the estate records lived. The shelves were in order. The accounts were in order. The correspondence with the Marrow Magistrate's office regarding Grimshaw's proceedings was progressing in its ponderous legal way toward a conclusion that the magistrate had indicated would be satisfactory. The damp was controlled. The Gessner volumes, 2 of them, the ones that had been sold rather than destroyed, had been located through Haverstock and returned to the collection at a price the Duke had described as reasonable and Eleanor had described as a rounding error in the account of what they were owed. She was sitting in the chair by the window. C.C. List chair. She had been sitting in it for several weeks now, because it was a good chair in a good position with good light, and Cecily had chosen it for exactly those qualities. And there was nothing in the use of a chair that could not be honored simply by sitting in it. The moral philosophy book was in her lap. She was not reading it. She was simply sitting with it. In the way you sit with something that has come right at last. She heard the Duke's footsteps in the corridor. She had learned them early, the particular pace of a man who had spent 18 months walking through his own house as a visitor and was still, fractionally, adjusting to the difference. He came to the library door and stopped. She looked up. "You've put the whole house in order," he said from the doorway. "The accounts, the collection, the tenants, the east wing roof. There's nothing left to save." He looked at her with the open face. The face she thought she would spend a long time learning and never entirely finish. "What will you do with yourself now?" Eleanor looked at him. The candle on the table between them burned steady and clear. The shelves were full and quiet around them. The window was open its customary 2 inches. Because the library needed to breathe, and the cold of the night came in and balanced the warmth of the room into something exactly right. "You'll find something," she said. "I always do. I cannot bear waste. You know that it's my besetting sin that I have noticed," he said. "That your besetting sin has an impressive rate of return." "Come and sit down," she said. "You're standing in the doorway again. You look like you're drowning." That he came in and sat down. The fire was low and the candle was good and the room breathed around them, honeyed and honest and full. A room that had been holding its breath for 2 years and had finally, this autumn, been allowed to let it go. Eleanor set the moral philosophy book on the table. She reached into the pocket of her dress and took out the strip of dark red ribbon, Cecily's bookmark. The one she had been carrying for 3 months. She opened the book to the last annotated page, to the line in dark pencil. "The problem with being careful is that eventually you are careful of the wrong thing." She placed the ribbon carefully in the spine. She smoothed it flat. She closed the book and set it on the table with the ribbon marking that page, and the book sat there in the candlelight, complete. No longer interrupted. She had been intending to put it back on the shelf for 3 months. She understood now why she had not. She had been waiting until it meant what it now meant, not a question left open, but an answer arrived at. The Duke looked at the book. He looked at the ribbon. He did not ask about it. "Cecily would have argued with you," he said. About everything. She argued with everyone. You told me that. In October that I am telling you again. I find I want to tell you things twice now. I'm not sure what that means that I think, Eleanor said. It means you've stopped being careful of the wrong things that he looked at her across the low fire, and the candle burned, and the window was open 2 inches, and the library held them both in its old and now honest dark. Full of books that had been saved and accounts that were true and a collection that knew, after everything, where every volume Saturday outside, the grounds of Lark Court lay quiet under the November sky. The grey mare grazed in the near paddock. Sound and easy. The dower house at the park's edge showed a light in its window. The groundsman's cottage roof was weathertight that I and the church at the end of the drive, under a stone that said only her name and her dates, and she kept the books. Cecily Ashworth lay in the good dark, and did not know. And did not need to know, that her question had been answered. That is silence ever truly neutral? It was not. But neither, it turned out, was speaking. Both required choosing. Both had consequences. The choosing was the thing. Eleanor Moore, Eleanor Stone, Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess of Northwell, who had come to Lark Court to disappear and had become, in the end, the most thoroughly documented woman in the county, sat in the library where she had saved her first book from a flood, and found, to her great and lasting surprise, that being seen by the right person was not the danger she had spent her whole life fearing. That it was the only safety worth the name.